So now let's talk about ventilators. So say that you just intubated a patient. You did a great job, and then the respiratory tech walks in with this ventilator with like 1,000 knobs on it and asks you, what vent settings do you want, doc? So let's go over those. First, let's just name off a bunch of different settings before we talk about them. The first thing that everyone talks about is the mode. Then there's the tidal volume and the respiratory rate. There's the fraction of inspired oxygen, or FiO2, and the Peep. And finally, the inspiratory flow rate, or you might also set the I to E ratio, inspiration to exhalation ratio. So let's review each one of those. So first, let's talk about the mode. And in talking about the mode, there's really two important breathing patterns we need to consider. The patients and the ventilators. So I'll draw the patient's breathing patterns in brown and the vent's breathing patterns in green. So the first mode we'll talk about is CMV, or continuous mandatory ventilation. So in this one, you set the ventilator to give a breath at a certain tidal volume every so many seconds, and so it's just going to keep doing that and giving that breath that often So let's say we set the rate to be 10, so that would mean the different distance between each breath would be 6 seconds, right? 60 divided by 10. So every 6 seconds it's going to give a breath, and the ventilator does not care what the patient's doing. So if the patient tries to take a deep breath here, and it's hard to breathe through the vent, it goes ahead and does it, and then the patient happens to time one with that, it gets a bunch of air shoved down his throat, then he tries to take another one here, and he's got to fight it, and right immediately afterward the ventilator is going to give him a breath. Then he waits a long time, then the ventilator gives him a breath, then he tries to take another small breath, no help from the ventilator gives him another breath. So you can see that these guys are kind of moving independently. Whatever the patient does is ignored by the ventilator. And so this mode is really only useful for patients who are completely out of it, paralyzed and sedated. Because otherwise, they have a flat, let's say it's just flat like that. Otherwise, it's just too obnoxious to be given these huge breaths when you're not expecting it and to try to breathe against the ventilator. And so we don't really use CMV anymore. Actually, the one that we do use is something called assist controlled. And so what assist control means is that if you try to take your own breath, the ventilator is going to assist you and give you a hand. If you don't take a breath, it's going to take over control and give you a breath. So let's say that we set the vent to have a rate of 10 again, so we're going to have a breath every 6 seconds. And let's say the guy's breathing much like we drew earlier, so I'll just copy that again. And so now what the ventilator is going to do is give you a hand. So let's say it sees you're taking a breath here and says, okay, there you go, I'll help you out. You don't have to do all the work of the breathing there. And then 5 seconds goes by, so not even a full 6 seconds, then you take another breath. It says, oh, sure, man, I'll help you out there, and gives you another breath. And then here's another 5 seconds, and then boom, another breath. And then it's going and going and going. Now 6 seconds has passed, and notice you haven't taken a breath, so it's going to give you a full breath here. And then it goes again, 6 seconds has passed. You haven't taken a breath, I'm going to give you another breath. And immediately after you take a breath, you're taking a breath? Fine, I'll give you one. And then another 6 seconds passes, and it goes on like that. So you can see here it's an assist. These breaths here are assisted. You took a breath and it assisted it for you. These breaths here, notice 6 seconds had gone by and you didn't take a breath, so it took control and it gave you a breath. Hence, again, the name assist control. Now you can imagine what the vent's going to do in an apneic patient. It's going to sense no breath, so every 6 seconds it's going to give you a breath. And it's going to just take over control. So what you'll notice here now is that assist control in the apneic patient is very similar to CMV, right? You're going to get the breath every 6 seconds if you're not initiating your own breath. So that's another one. Another thing that you might notice is that here, the patient got 2 breaths right next to each other. So that might be a lot of ventilation more than we want to do. So let's say our patient is breathing similarly to up there, again. And now you can have intermittent mandatory ventilation. And there's also a synchronized IMV, SIMV as well. And basically what this does is the ventilator is going to let you take your own breath. And every 6 seconds it'll help you. But should you breathe faster than every 6 seconds? Let's see, you took one there, you took one there. And so this one came too close, 6 seconds hasn't passed. It's not going to help you. And then I might do one there. So it will let you take your own breath, but it won't let you do them too fast. So the main one that we're going to use in the emergency department is assist control. That's the main mode we're going to use. And let me say just one more thing about modes, and that is to talk about pressure-controlled modes and volume-controlled modes. So all those modes we had just talked about are volume-controlled, and I will also talk about pressure-controlled. And what this means is the thing that we set on the ventilator, the thing that we control in those is the volume. And so then the pressure is determined by the patient's lungs. And so then conversely, with pressure control modes, we are setting the pressure, and the volume is determined by the patient's lungs. This always used to confuse the heck out of me, and this is really the concept of compliance. And so I think of compliance by thinking of a balloon. So here we have a balloon, it's empty, and let's say we set it on a pressure-controlled mode. So we're going to keep putting air into this balloon until we reach a pressure. Let's say we set that pressure to be 30. So we're going to keep pumping air into that balloon until that pressure reaches 30. Once it reaches 30, the airflow stops. So how much volume is in this balloon? Well, that really depends on the balloon. If we had just taken the balloon out of the package and tried to blow it up like that, that balloon is kind of stiff, it's kind of rigid, so it's harder to blow up, and so pressure builds up in there more quickly, so we fit less volume. However, if we take another balloon out and we stretch it and stretch it and stretch it, we're making it more flexible, more malleable. Now we can get more pressure in there we can get more volume in there without increasing the pressure so fast. So we can get more volume in. So in the case of that rigid balloon, the one that is not very compliant, a little bit of pressure is going to generate volume more quickly than one that is more compliant, so a more stretchy balloon, in which case we could fit more volume in. Let's look at that in another way. Let's say now we're just going to put a predetermined volume in the balloon. So we're going to put in 500 cc's of air into this balloon. And we're not going to stop until we get all that volume in there. And once we get that volume in there, we stop. So in this case, it's very similar. So in a balloon that comes right out of the package, it's very rigid, stiff, we're going to generate a lot of pressure with that volume because that balloon is not very stretchy. However, if we did stretch it out and make that balloon more flexible and malleable, now we can get that 500 cc's in there without generating too much pressure. So again, you can see that we are controlling the volume here, but the lungs are determining the pressure. And that's all based on the compliance of the lungs. Next is the rate. And most of us breathe at about 12 breaths per minute. And so that's a pretty fair rate to set someone at. But as we'll talk about later, there are some very good reasons to deviate from this number and make it either higher or lower. And now let's talk about the tidal volume, or V sub T. And we used to use tidal volumes of 8 to 10 cc's per kilogram. But subsequent studies have said, no, that's way too much, and that can actually cause damage. So we use more lung protective volumes of 6 to 8 cc's per kilo. And remember, this is for ideal body weight, not actual body weight. Right? The lungs of this normal-sized guy, who is, say, 5'10", and let's say we get another person who's also 5'10", and I ask you, who's got bigger lungs? And the answer is neither of them. They got the exact same size lungs. Just because this guy's got a lot of extra adipose outside of his chest doesn't make his lungs any bigger. So you go with ideal body weight. And I wouldn't be calculating this. What I'd probably do is I'd say, okay, this guy's 5'10". I'd look around the room and I'd say, who around here is 5'10"? Oh, that guy is. What does he weigh? He probably weighs about 70 kilos. And I'd go with that. Just an estimate. Unless you like doing that calculation, then go ahead and knock yourself out. The next one we're going to talk about is the FiO2, or the fraction of inspired oxygen. And it's probably safest to start at 100%, because you figure during intubation the patient's not breathing, they're going to be apneic for a while, and so you want to get as much oxygen as you can inside of them. But we know that high oxygen is actually toxic, and so we want to quickly bring that down. So 100% is a good place to start, but we're going to want to bring that down. And we'll talk about a good way to do that as well. And the last thing we got to talk about is the inspiratory flow rate. And what that is how fast the breath goes in. So remember we set the rate to 10 before? And that corresponded to 1 breath every 6 seconds. And then we also set the tidal volume. Let's say we set that at 500 or half a liter. Now for the inspiratory flow rate, we set a speed with which we're going to shove that half a liter into the patient within that 6 seconds. So let's say we set that to be 60 to 80 liters per minute. And so just for the sake of this example, let's make it 80 liters per minute. All right, hold on. We're going to do some math. So we have 80 liters per minute. 1 minute is 60 seconds. And we're doing half a liter. So now all these units cancel here. Boom, boom. This becomes 4, and that becomes 3. And 1/2 here is the same as putting a 2 over there. And so that ends up to be 8/3. And of course I had to make this math super duper hard, but this thing is all upside down, right? Because I have seconds in the denominator, so let's flip it over. And so you have 3/8 seconds, and that means we're going to give that half a liter in 0.375 seconds. So that's how long it's going to take for the patient to inhale. And then that gives the patients 5.625 seconds for exhalation. Why the heck am I doing all this math, you might ask? You'll see. It's going to come in handy a little bit later. But the main point I want you to get here is the faster you shove the air in, the less time it's going to take to go in for inhalation. It gives you more time for exhalation. So that's inspiratory flow rate. And so again, we talked about I to E ratio before, so this is one way to set that. The faster you go it in, the lower the I, the bigger the E. So we talked about a bunch of vent settings. So we talked about the mode, and that could be either pressure controlled or volume controlled. And in the ER, we're mostly going to use volume control in our adults, and we're going to use a specific mode called assist control. Pressure control you might use in kids in the pediatric ICU. Don't worry about it. For us, we're talking about volume control. We're talking about assist control. We also mentioned the rate and the tidal volume. And for the tidal volume, we were going to give 6 to 8 cc's per kg, the lung-sparing doses. And remember that this is for ideal body weight. Make a good guess. Other settings we have to mention are the FiO2. And remember, we're going to start at 100 and then decrease it quickly. Also, the inspiratory flow rate, which is how fast the air goes in. Oh, and one we forgot to talk about was Peep. And Peep stands for positive end expiratory pressure. So if we return to our balloon here and it's filled up and now we're going to let all the air come out, then when that's done, the balloon is empty and the pressure inside the balloon is 0 compared to outside the balloon. So there's no difference between the pressure out here and the pressure in here. Now, positive end expiratory pressure means we're going to leave a little bit of pressure in the balloon at the end of exhalation. So maybe if in the balloon case, we would pinch the end of the balloon and not let all the air out, so a little bit of pressure remains in there. And the setting that everyone always sets on the vent is a PEEP of +5, for whatever reason. So that's ventilator settings. So go back and watch this a couple of times if you need to get a good understanding of mode, rate, tidal volume, FiO2, inspiratory flow rate, and PEEP. And in the next videos, we're going to talk about type 1 and type 2 respiratory failure and how do we pick values for these things. All right, thanks a lot. Bye-bye.